Hello, my dear listener. Tonight, we travel back to the golden age of the Ottoman Empire, to a world of silk and whispers, where behind the marble walls of Topkapi Palace, a young captive from distant lands rose to become one of the most powerful women in history. Her laughter would change the course of an empire. Her name was Hürrem Sultan. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it in your corner of the world? The wind smelled of snow and pine when the world I knew ended. My mother used to say the winter sky was a mirror of the soul, clear, bright, and merciless. I believed her then. I was a child of the northern lands, a girl who knew nothing of gold or sultans or the sea. My world was the hum of prayer from our wooden church, the laughter of my younger brother chasing geese through the muddy lanes of Roxelana, the grainy warmth of bread my mother kneaded by the small square window, and the way dusk arrived like a slow hymn. It began with hooves, a low thunder rolling down from the hills before the roosters stirred. Shouts followed, harsh syllables that did not belong to our tongue. Then fire. Roof thatch caught like dry straw in summer. Flames licking the gray sky, smoke turning the morning into night. Men on horseback moved through the lanes like shadows cut out of iron. Their blades flashed the color of winter sun on water. My brother tried to run. My mother caught him to her chest and called God by every name she knew. The sound of wood breaking, the brief, impossible stillness before the scream. Her hand reached for me and missed. I ran barefoot. Mud and snow and blood became one thing beneath my feet. The cold was a mouth that tried to swallow breath. A fist in my hair stopped me. Rope bit my wrists and found the quick pulse there. Someone laughed. An ugly, careless sound from a life that had forgotten mercy. We were herded toward the road. Women, children, the old. A caravan of breathing ghosts. Days stretched until they forgot their ends. Hunger learned my name. The earth turned from white to iron brown. When we slept, the cold crept into the bones and curled there like an animal. I discovered that grief can live without tears. The eyes dry first. It's the heart that keeps weeping. At night I whispered into the wind, "Mother, can you hear me?" They say the wind carries prayers, but mine are too heavy. If I forget your face, may the stars remember it for me. Sometimes the snow fell so softly, it felt like heaven answering. But heaven was busy, or far, or silent. We came at last to the sea. The Black Sea, they called it, and it looked exactly like the color of despair. The ships groaned like wounded beasts. Chains clinked. Tar and salt and sickness were the smell of this new world. I pressed my forehead to the rough planks and tried to dream my way home. When I succeeded, waking was a second captivity. One night I dreamed differently. I stood before a river made of glass. Beneath its surface floated crowns and broken mirrors. When I touched the water, it burned like ice. From its depths rose a voice, neither man nor woman, whispering, "Power will love you, and love will destroy you." I woke with the taste of salt on my tongue and knew I had begun to fear not death, but destiny. Kaffa was noise and bargaining, and human breath turned into price. We were lined upon a wooden platform and cataloged like objects. Hair, eyes, teeth, the clarity of skin. This one will fetch a high price. Red hair, green eyes, spring through frost, someone said, and laughter answered. It was there I saw him. Not a buyer greedy for beauty, but a man wrapped in deep blue silk with a gaze that measured, as if counting a poem's beats. He lifted my chin. I refused to lower my eyes. Something in the refusal pleased him. A single word. Topkapi. I did not know it yet, but it would become the shape of my fate. The voyage ended beneath a sky that glittered with gulls. Istanbul rose like a miracle. Domes and minarets like silver mountains. The call to prayer drifting over water, as if time itself were singing. The air smelled of cinnamon and salt, and 1,000 lives crossing in one place. We were led uphill through streets of colored light and narrow shadow to a set of gates that held back both a city and a dream. Topkapi Palace, iron and gold, guarded by men with faces that had forgotten surprise. Inside, tiled courtyards where fountains murmured secrets. Gardens where cypresses held the sky on their dark shoulders. Corridors where the sun scattered into 1,000 shapes through lattice and glass. Beauty can be another form of cage. I learned that lesson with my first breath of rose-scented air. They washed us in rose water until sorrow had to fight for its scent. Silk replaced rags. My hair, combed and braided, became a story someone else would tell. My name was taken, and in its place, a new one set upon my tongue like a coin. Hurrem, the cheerful one. The irony bit and then went quiet. Sometimes names are not mirrors, but commands. The harem was a world of silences that spoke. Eunuchs moved like patient shadows, their eyes taking measurement instead of pity. The usta, women made of endurance, taught us how to live where the walls listened. How to walk like water, how to pour tea like song, how to bend without breaking. A woman's silence, one said, can be more faithful than her tears. I stitched that into my soul. Historical interlude. The palace rhythm. Mornings began with the echo of the ezan from Hagia Sophia, crossing the bright water. After prayers, servants drifted through marble corridors, balancing trays, a glimmer of pomegranate jam, bread warm as breath, china that clinked like delicate bells. Peacocks shimmered in the courtyards. Parrots from India tried on our words and returned them with strange music. Fountains whispered verses cut into stone, and steam rose from the bathhouses where marble learned the language of water. Beauty here was choreographed, a ballet of devotion and power, anchored by silence. I learned Turkish the way a drowning girl learns air. Greedy, grateful, one breath at a time. Words became handholds on the cliff face of survival. Bow low, but not to the floor. Smile, but let the smile keep its secret. Hear the jealousy before it grows teeth. We were a mosaic, Persian, Circassian, Greek, African, polished until the light loved us. Each of us hid a story. Each story hid a blade. The Valide Sultan entered the hall like a law. Jewels stitched dawn into her sleeves. When she passed, the air tidied itself. She paused before me. Name, she said. Hurrem, I answered. Cheerful, she repeated, tasting the word. A brave name for a slave. A pause, almost a mercy. Keep your cheer. The palace eats sorrow quickly, but chokes on joy. Her gaze lingered like a finger against glass, as if she could feel the heat gathering behind it. Nights belong to the lattice and the moon. I pressed my brow to the carved wood and made a pact with the quiet. I will not fade. I will not be the echo that forgets its voice. I will rise, maybe slowly, maybe unseen, but I will rise. The moon offered no answer. Sometimes that is the answer we need. Time became a silk rope, soft to the hand, strong enough to bind. Weeks unspooled. The harem's order revealed itself like a pattern in tile. At the top, the Valide Sultan, whose silence could turn to decree. Beneath, the favored consorts whose names the walls remembered. Beneath them, the sea of those who might never be called. I learned the current, where it tugged and where it drowned. Charm is a weapon. Silence, armor. Whispers carried further than footsteps. The Sultan returns. The Sultan returns. Drums rose from the palace belly. Lanterns multiplied like stars brought low. We were arranged along the gallery to receive a gaze we were forbidden to seek. He appeared beneath an arch of gold. Suleiman, wrapped in blue and authority. His face was carved in patience, his stride the measure of a kingdom. For the span of a heartbeat, his eyes found mine. A flicker, nothing more. And yet it felt like a seal pressed into wax. That night, sleep broke like thin ice. A dream returned. I walked a river of light. Beneath the skin of water, crowns drifted beside broken mirrors. The river spoke. You will love the sun and burn in its light. I woke with the taste of iron in my mouth and the understanding that prophecy is only a mirror we are too honest to look away from. Days afterward, the Usta selected girls to serve at an evening of music in the Pavilion of Roses. My name was among them. They dressed me in a gown, the color of first leaves, threaded with gold. Henna traced quiet stories in my palms. A veil of gauze was set upon my hair, so thin it hid nothing, so soft it promised distance. Lanterns swayed, the marble floor borrowed the night and returned it brighter. Musicians tuned an oud, a ni, a kanun. Notes that sounded like doors opening, very slowly. I carried a tray of sherbet to the divan. He sat with poets and viziers, light and shadow sharing his face. My hands trembled once, and then remembered their training. Pomegranate and rose braided the air between us. Name? He asked. Hurrem, I said. Cheerful one, he answered. And the name, once mockery, became a question. Do you live up to it? I lifted my eyes as if raising a curtain. I try, my lord, I said, even in the darkest nights. Something like surprise moved through his gaze, and then it was gone. Music filled the places words could not reach. When the night ended, I returned to my chamber carrying nothing but an echo. Soon after, I was assigned to the library. Shelves of walnut, air of parchment and ink, candles standing like quiet sentries. When no one watched, I traced the flow of letters with a fingertip. Lines that curved like river, dots like stars. He entered without announcement, carrying a book. You again, he said, almost amused. My duty brings me where I am told, my lord. And do you still try to be cheerful? It seems to please your majesty. A soft laugh like thunder far away. Do you read? In my tongue, yes. In yours, not yet. Then learn, he said. A woman who reads can rule more than hearts. Lessons began with an old scholar who smelled of ink and prayer. The Ottoman script unfurled. Strokes that kissed and parted, a dance of restraint and grace. I read verses of Rumi and Hafiz. Love as fire that does not consume, surrender as the bravest kind of rule. The words moved furniture inside me, made rooms where I could live without fear. Historical interlude, the weave of a day. Dawn, figs and jasmine in the garden's breath. Noon, the muezzin's voice threading stone to sky. Dusk, the Bosphorus turning to hammered gold. Night, footsteps softened by carpets, secrets braided into the steam of the baths, silver bowls chiming in kitchens where saffron taught milk the color of sunrise. The palace was a body. We were its breath. Rumor is a servant with too many masters. It found my name quickly. A red-haired girl, the Sultan smiled differently. The library door opened more often. The harem arranged its masks, Friendly, curious, jealous, afraid. I learned to wear serenity like silk, light and impossible to stain. One evening I pressed my forehead to the lattice and spoke to the woman I would become. If you are out there, waiting, send me a sign. The sign was not a star, not a word, not even a glance. It was the simple knowledge that patience is a tide, unseen, relentless, shaping stone. And somewhere beyond the gilded doors, destiny breathed, so gently that only the very still could hear it. Mother, can you hear me across this endless sea? They say the wind carries prayers, but mine are too heavy. I do not know where they carry me, only that your voice is the only light that does not fade. If I forget your face, may the moon remember it for me. The moon did not answer. It did not need to. I had already learned her lesson. To rule by pulling tides no one can see. I slept then, and the palace slept with me. Fountains muttering to themselves, lanterns swaying through their last inches of flame, the Bosphorus breathing like a giant animal in the dark. Somewhere, a door closed. Somewhere, a future opened. I did not know yet which one was mine. But I knew this. I would not be the echo. I would be the voice. And the voice had begun to find its language when dawn returned. It came wrapped in gold and rumor. The palace woke differently that morning, quieter, expectant, like a sea holding its breath. Whispers rustled between marble columns and perfumed curtains. The Sultan has noticed the red-haired girl, the cheerful one, the foreigner. The words followed me like shadows. I told myself they were only wind, only passing curiosity. But the wind in Topkapi never passed. It carried stories like pollen, and they always found somewhere to grow. Days turned to mirrors of one another. Lessons in music and poetry, rituals of movement and obedience. Still, sometimes, I felt his gaze before I saw him. A weightless heat, like sunlight finding its mark. He no longer looked through me. He looked at me. And in that quiet attention, my heart began to both bloom and tremble. The Sultan was unlike any man I had ever seen. Power had made a home in his silence. He spoke rarely, but when he did, the air itself listened. His eyes were not cruel, but neither were they kind. They were fathomless, the color of iron underwater. He called me again to the pavilion of roses. That night, the fountains glowed like liquid moonlight. Musicians plucked strings soft as breath. A poet recited verses of Rumi, his voice weaving between us like incense. When the Sultan's gaze found mine, I forgot the difference between breath and prayer. Later, I dreamed again. I was standing in a garden of white lilies. Each one whispered a word I could not understand. When I bent to listen closer, the petals turned to parchment covered in strange letters. Ottoman script. The letters bled into light, and from the light, a face appeared. My own, crowned with a crescent of flame. Then came a voice. Your laughter will open doors. Your silence will close them. Choose carefully which to use. When I woke, dawn had already reached my window, pale and trembling. The days after that dream unfolded like silk. I began to see the invisible architecture of power, how smiles were traded for influence, how silence could bend a room. The Valid Sultan summoned me more often now, her questions disguised as kindness. Do you enjoy your lessons, Hurrem? Yes, my lady. And your prayers? They keep me still. Good, she said softly. Stillness is the beginning of wisdom. Her words brushed me like a warning. Then came the night that changed everything. I was summoned to the Sultan's private chambers. The eunuch's face gave nothing away. His torchlight stretched shadows long as years. My heart pounded like a drum as I walked through corridors that smelled of sandalwood and secrecy. He was waiting by the open window, the Bosphorus glimmering behind him like a river made of stars. The sound of the water mixed with the murmur of distant music. He turned when I entered. "Do you fear me?" he asked. "I fear only silence, my lord," I said. He smiled faintly. "Then you are wise." He gestured for me to sit, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Only the sea spoke, its endless recitation. He began to ask questions about my homeland, the winters, the color of the fields after rain. He wanted to know the smell of my mother's bread, the songs of my village. Each answer was a thread, weaving a bridge between us. At last he said, "You speak of sorrow as though it were a friend." "Perhaps it is," I answered. "It taught me how to survive." He looked at me for a long time. "Then you are stronger than you appear." When I returned to my chambers, the women watched in silence. They didn't need to ask. A single look at my face told them the balance had shifted. Mahidevran Sultan's laughter, once soft and regal, now cut like glass. Her son Mustafa was the empire's darling, the future, the light. And I, a girl of snow and smoke, had become her shadow's rival. Weeks later, jealousy grew teeth. Mahidevran passed me in the corridor, her perfume sharp with rage. "You should remember where you came from," she whispered. "Mud does not become marble." I bowed slightly. "But both can be broken, my lady." Her hand struck before I could finish. The ring on her finger tore my lip. The taste of iron filled my mouth. She left with her head high, victory burning behind her, like perfume. But pain is a strange alchemy. It can turn humiliation into clarity. That night, as I washed the blood from my face, I looked into the mirror and said to my reflection, "I will never let her see me bleed again." Then, softly to the girl within me, I added, "We are not mud. We are fire disguised as clay." The next morning, I was summoned. The Sultan's eyes darkened when he saw the bruise. He said nothing, but his silence carried the force of a decree. Mahidevran was never again called to his chambers. The wind inside the harem changed direction. Historical interlude. The rhythm of vengeance and favor. Whispers are sharper than daggers in Topkapi. The women watched me with veiled hatred, but I had learned patience. Every act of cruelty toward me became a thread I could later weave into power. I smiled through every rumor. The Valid Sultan said to me once, "Joy is armor. Wear it well," so I did, until my laughter became legend. Months passed. I was no longer the frightened girl who arrived in chains. I had become something else, something that looked like serenity but felt like strategy. He summoned me often now, not for duty but for company. We read poetry together, his voice slow and deep, mine trembling like a new instrument. He taught me the verses of Hafiz. Even after all this time, the sun never says to the earth, "You owe me." Look what happens with a love like that. It lights the whole sky, I asked him. Does a sultan know how to love without owing? He looked at me for a long time before answering, "Ask me when the wars are over." The Valid Sultan began to watch us more closely. Her expression never changed, but her questions grew sharper. She once said, "You think love will protect you. It never does. It only makes you visible." And she was right. But I had already accepted that visibility was the price of destiny. That night, I dreamed again. A hawk flew above a silver sea, its wings burning yet unconsumed. When it cried out, the echo returned as my own voice. I woke in darkness, my heart racing. It was then I understood. I had become part of the dream I used to fear. From that day, my laughter filled the palace halls. The Sultan said it chased away the weight of his crown. He began to call me my Hurrem, and the name felt less like irony, more like truth. But even as joy grew, shadows lengthened. For in Topkapi, happiness is never without witnesses, and witnesses always have a price. That winter, the sky above Istanbul burned with stars, and I finally realized that my destiny had begun. It did not roar like thunder. It whispered, softly, like a flame catching silk. And somewhere, beyond marble and moonlight, the world turned toward my name. The first time I heard him laugh, truly laugh, it was like hearing a river after years of drought. The Sultan was a man carved by duty. His laughter felt like rebellion against the weight of empires. And I was the echo that gave it shape. He began to summon me not for service, but for conversation. Sometimes we read poetry by candlelight. Sometimes he would simply watch the lamps flicker against the marble walls and ask about the color of the snow in my homeland. It was strange. The most powerful man in the world asking about small, useless things. But that was where love began, in the useless things that mattered to no one else. One night, he brought me to the terrace above the gardens. The city shimmered below us like a sea of fireflies. The Bosphorus was a black mirror. Istanbul, he said, is both a bride and a battlefield. Every man who loves her must fight for her. Then he turned to me. And what about you, Hurrem? What do you fight for? For the right to belong to myself, I said softly. He smiled. And do you? Not yet, I answered. But I will. His gaze held mine, and I knew he believed me. It wasn't love at first. It was curiosity that deepened into admiration, admiration into tenderness, and tenderness into something far more dangerous. We were both aware of it, yet neither spoke it aloud. In Topkapi, love unspoken is safer than love confessed. But one evening, he said, the poets say that a heart is a kingdom too. If that is true, then you have conquered mine. And that was how it began, with a sentence that sounded like poetry and ended like history. The women in the harem felt it before they saw it. Mahidevran's laughter vanished. The servants walked with bowed heads. The Valide Sultan prayed longer each night. I became the calm before a storm that only I could hear coming. Jealousy grew like ivy along the walls, silent but persistent. I did not answer it with words. I answered it with grace, with learning, with patience. Every insult became a stone for the path I was building. The Sultan said to me once, "You are not what they expect." "What do they expect?" "A jewel," he said. "Silent, polished, easily lost. But you are not that. You are a flame, and the world forgets that flames are not ornaments." Historical interlude, the empire in motion. Outside the palace, the world burned with conquest. The banners of the Ottoman armies reached far beyond the horizon. Belgrade, Rhodes, Hungary. Messengers arrived daily, bringing letters written in the dust of battlefields. At night, the Sultan would read them aloud, his voice calm, unbroken. When he spoke of war, it was not glory I heard in him, but weariness. For a man who commands death learns quickly that victory is only a quieter kind of loss. Sometimes I would see him standing by the window after such reports, his face hidden by shadow. He looked less like a ruler then, and more like a man searching for something beyond his reach. I never asked what it was. I only stood beside him and let my silence say, "I am here." Soon, he trusted me with matters no woman in the harem was meant to hear. He asked my opinion about letters, about alliances, about people whose names I barely knew. I spoke carefully, each word chosen like a piece of gold weighed in a jeweler's hand. "Tell me," he said once, "why do you think so differently from the others?" "Because I have nothing left to lose," I said. "Is that freedom?" he asked. "It's the beginning of it." He smiled. "Then perhaps you are freer than I." Ibrahim Pasha, the Grand Vizier, began to notice the change. He was tall, handsome, brilliant, and dangerous. He had been the Sultan's closest friend since boyhood, his confidant, his mirror. But mirrors grow uneasy when a new reflection appears. He greeted me one afternoon in the Garden of the Fountains. "You read now," he said, "and the Sultan listens when you speak." "That is rare," I bowed slightly. "Perhaps he only listens because my words sound strange." "Strange things have power," he said, "but power has its cost." He looked toward the palace. "Be careful, Hurrem. This place remembers its ghosts at night." I thought of his words and wondered if I, too, was becoming a ghost. Not the kind that haunts, but the kind that endures. Then came the spring when the air smelled of jasmine and prophecy. One evening, as the sun bled into the sea, I told the Sultan I was with child. For a moment he said nothing. Then he rose and placed his hand gently over mine. "Then the world will begin again," he said. And for once, the weight of empire left his face, replaced by something pure, wonder. When my son was born, the palace changed. The women who had once mocked me now bowed lower than before. They brought trays of sweet sherbet and whispered blessings they did not mean. But their envy no longer mattered. In my arms, I held my true crown, my son Mehmet. The Sultan entered quietly without ceremony. He looked down at the small, sleeping face and said, "He bears my blood and your fire. Then he will need both to survive," I whispered. He kissed the child's forehead, and he will. That night, as the baby slept beside me, I lay awake listening to the sound of his tiny breath. Each inhale felt like a promise, each exhale like a prayer. I realized that love, once born, is no longer a possession. It becomes a duty, and duty is heavier than any chain. I whispered, "My son, may you never learn the taste of fear, though you were born in a palace built from it." The Valide Sultan came to see the child days later. She held him for a long time, her face unreadable. "Every mother in this palace prays that her son will outlive her," she said quietly. "And yet those are the prayers that hurt the most when they're answered." She gave him back to me. "Protect him, Hurrem, and protect yourself." For his sake I bowed. But inside I felt the slow, heavy bloom of understanding. I was no longer fighting only for myself. I was fighting for a future that carried my blood. And that meant I could never stop. Sometimes I walked through the gardens alone at night. Mehmed's small blanket pressed to my heart. I watched the fountains shimmer beneath the moon and thought of the girl I once was, the girl who had run through the snow barefoot, chasing the sound of her mother's voice. She was still inside me, but now she was quiet, watching, waiting. Perhaps she was proud. One night, I dreamed again. I stood in a room without walls, filled with light. The air itself seemed alive. I heard a voice, gentle, endless, whisper, "You have built your freedom from the ashes of chains." When I turned, I saw a figure. My mother, smiling. she said. "You are not lost, my daughter. You are becoming." I woke with tears, and for the first time in years, they were not born of sorrow, but of grace. From that moment, I understood. Love was not my prison. It was my ladder. And every rung would carry me closer to the sky or to the fire that waited at its end. Either way, I would climb. They said a concubine could never be a queen. But fate, I learned, listens only to those who speak to it with fire. By the time my second son was born, whispers had become truths. No one dared speak against me aloud, but the air inside Topkapi was heavy with envy. Thick, perfumed, and poisonous. Each corridor hummed with secrets. Each gaze carried a question it dared not ask. I had become more than a woman. I had become a storm wrapped in silk. The Sultan trusted me now, not only with his heart, but with his thoughts. He read to me from books of philosophy, from Rumi, from Aristotle translated into Arabic. We talked of kingship, justice, and the weight of ruling men. Sometimes, when he spoke of battle, his voice would falter, the soldier inside him tiring of endless blood. "Do you think a ruler must be feared or loved?" he asked one evening as the Bosphorus breathed beneath our window. I answered, "If he is wise, he will be both. But if he cannot, let him be loved, for fear dies when he does, but love endures beyond the grave." He turned to me, a faint smile in his eyes. "And what endures of you, Hurrem?" "My laughter," I said softly, "and the sons who will carry its echo." Ibrahim Pasha watched all of this in silence. The once beloved friend of the Sultan now carried the shadow of suspicion like a second cloak. He had risen too high, built palaces more splendid than his masters, held audiences with foreign kings as though he himself wore the crown. And though I smiled when we met, my eyes never left his hands. He was too clever, too proud, too necessary, the most dangerous kind of man. He once told me in the garden, "You have learned this palace faster than anyone before you." "I listen," I said. "And what do you hear?" "The heartbeat of walls," I answered. "They tell me who is afraid." He studied me for a long moment. "Then you must hear a very loud heartbeat, my lady." Beyond the palace, the empire flourished like a garden watered with conquest. In the west, Hungarian fortresses fell. In the east, Persian cities trembled. Venetian envoys came bearing jewels, spices, and letters laced with envy. They wrote home of a woman behind the curtains of power, a red-haired enchantress whose words guided the Sultan more than his viziers. They called me Roxelana, the foreign queen. They said my smile could change decrees. They were not wrong. Still, I knew power was not owned. It was borrowed from the moment. And the moment is always waiting to be taken back. One night, I stood by the lattice and watched the moon carve silver lines over the domes of Istanbul. How strange, I thought, that a girl stolen from snow now rules through silence in a city of sun. The thought made me both proud and afraid, because even light casts shadows. The Sultan began to seek my counsel in matters of state. When foreign letters arrived, he read them to me aloud. Sometimes he asked, "What do you see here that I do not?" I would listen to the tone, not the words. Pride, I might say, or desperation. Or both, he nodded, as if my intuition completed his logic. Together we made decisions that would ripple through kingdoms. Yet within me, doubt grew, not of him, but of what the world would make of me. A woman's power is a fragile thing. It shines brightly, But the brighter it burns, the shorter it's allowed to live. At night, I spoke to myself in the language of silence. Do not forget what you are. You are still that girl who ran through snow. Your strength was not given. It was taken, earned, shaped in the fire of loss. Never bow to the illusion that love protects you. Only wisdom does. Sometimes I would light a single candle, watch its flame tremble in the draught, and whisper, if I fall, let me fall like this flame, graceful, bright, leaving warmth behind. The Valle de Sultan grew weaker as my power grew stronger. She had been both my judge and my teacher, my rival and my shield. When she fell ill, I visited her chamber, where the air smelled of rose oil and endings. She looked at me with eyes that had once held judgment, now filled with resignation. You've won, she said simply. I sought no victory, I whispered. We all seek something, she replied. You sought survival and found a throne instead. She reached for my hand. Remember this, Hurrem. When you stand at the top, the wind is cold. Keep your heart warm, or it will freeze before your crown. When she died, the palace mourned in silence. And I felt the world tilt. Because her absence meant that the only woman above me was now gone. After her passing, I moved through the palace as though through a dream. Every servant bowed lower, every vizier watched more carefully. Even Ibrahim's laughter had changed. Quieter, slower, wary. The Sultan, too, changed. Grief deepened him. He began to trust me more, lean on my words more often. And for the first time, I felt not only love for him, but a strange, aching pity. He was a man burdened by eternity, and I was the woman who would one day remind the world he had been human. The empire itself seemed to breathe with us. Spring returned, and the gardens of Topkapi filled with tulips like spilled paint. I walked among them one morning with my son Mehmed at my side. He asked, Mother, are these flowers alive forever? No, I said, nothing is. But while they bloom, they make the world believe in forever. He thought for a moment. Then I will be a tulip? I smiled. Then you must be the brightest one. That evening, I told the Sultan what our son had said. He laughed softly and kissed my forehead. He already speaks like a poet, he said. And you, my lord, I replied, already listen like a father. That summer, a feast was held in my honor, not announced, not named, but everyone knew. The courtyards shimmered with lanterns, the air hummed with music and perfume. I wore a gown the color of night, threaded with gold like captured starlight. When I entered, the murmurs fell silent. For the first time, they bowed not to a concubine, but to the woman who had changed the empire. Later, as the musicians played and laughter echoed, I looked toward the Sultan. He was watching me, his expression unreadable. When the music softened, he came to me and said quietly, There is no throne high enough to look down on you now. I lowered my gaze. Then may I never forget how far I have climbed. He smiled, and may you never fall. That night, long after the torches died, I walked alone through the garden. The fountains whispered secrets. The roses leaned toward the wind. I thought of everything that had led me here. Chains, fear, courage, love, and how each had been both prison and key. The moon glowed white above the domes, and for a moment I thought I saw my reflection in it. Not the frightened girl, not the laughing woman, but something else. A figure made of both light and shadow, mother and monarch, lover and strategist. And I whispered to her, I know who you are now. You are me. Far beyond the palace walls, The world whispered my name. In Venice, in Persia, in the cold courts of Poland, they spoke of me as myth, as miracle, as menace. Letters arrived addressed to the Sultan, but their ink smelled faintly of curiosity about me. I began to reply, carefully, respectfully, never signing my name, yet always letting my voice be known. Words became my weapon, diplomacy my disguise. To the King of Poland, I wrote, I was once of your land. Tell your people this, that a woman who survives captivity may learn to rule it, that mercy endures longer than fear. And in those words, I began to understand something deeper, that the pen, too, is a crown. But not all power is silent. In the shadows, Ibrahim Pasha moved like a gathering storm. He still smiled, but his eyes no longer bowed. And though I did not yet know it, our fates were already walking toward each other, slowly, inevitably, like two rivers destined to meet and flood. The palace had grown quiet, too quiet, like a vast orchestra waiting for a single note to begin the next movement. Outside, spring returned to Istanbul. Tulips blazed in the courtyards, crimson and gold, trembling in the wind like tiny fires. The fountains sang softly to themselves, and the Bosphorus breathed its endless lullaby. But beneath all that beauty, tension moved like a hidden river. I had learned long ago that peace is only another mask the world wears before it strikes. The Sultan had become older, heavier with the years of rule. His beard was streaked with silver now. His eyes, though still bright, carried the weight of memory. But his voice, that deep, measured calm, had not changed. When he spoke, the air itself still bent to listen. At night, we would sit together in silence, our chairs facing the open balcony. The moon would scatter over the water like spilled silver. He would rest his hand on mine, and I would feel his pulse, slow, steady, patient as the empire itself. Sometimes he would say, Hurrem, the world grows colder. The wars no longer call to me as they once did, and I would answer softly, then let peace call to you instead. He smiled, but his eyes turned away. Peace is never a guest that stays long. Ibrahim Pasha's shadow still stretched across the palace. He was grand, dazzling, untouchable. The soldiers called him the pillar of the empire. But even pillars, when cracked, bring the whole temple down. He held feasts greater than the sultan's, his palaces glowing with gold and silk. Foreign envoys bowed to him as if he were a king himself. He was loyal, yes, but loyalty that believes itself greater than its master is no loyalty at all. And I began to see what the Sultan refused to see, that ambition wears friendship's face until it learns to devour it. One evening, the Sultan sat before the fire, a letter open in his hands. The wax seal bore Ibrahim's crest. He read in silence, his expression unreadable. I watched the flames play across his face, gold and shadow, light and doubt. At last he said quietly, Ibrahim has begun to forget where the line between us lies. I rose, poured him sherbet, and said only, power never forgets. Men do. He looked at me then, long and searching. Do you think I should fear him? I smiled faintly. No, my lord, but I think he should fear himself. That night I could not sleep. The moon hung pale and thin, like a blade hidden in mist. I walked through the silent halls, barefoot, the marble cold beneath my feet. The air smelled of roses and ink, the scent of both beauty and command. In the stillness, I heard my own thoughts whisper, if you protect him, he will destroy you both. If you act, you will destroy what he once was. It was then I realized power demands sacrifice, and sometimes the heart it asks for is your own. Venetian envoys wrote home, the Sultan grows distant from his vizier. A woman's counsel replaces his old friend's voice. They said it like an accusation. I heard it as prophecy. Letters began to vanish from Ibrahim's chambers, intercepted by loyal hands. Reports reached the Sultan's ears of gifts, of secret dealings, of coins bearing his vizier's name. The empire, vast as it was, had begun to murmur with unease. And through it all, I remained silent. Because sometimes silence does more than words ever could. Then came the night of the feast, a celebration for the empire's victories, or perhaps a requiem no one yet knew they were attending. The palace shimmered with torchlight. Music danced through the air. Gold wine filled crystal cups. Ibrahim stood near the Sultan, smiling as though the world still belonged to him. His eyes, proud and careless, met mine once across the hall. He bowed slightly. I returned the gesture, calm, composed, unreadable. The Sultan's laughter filled the chamber, but I saw his hand tighten around his cup. He was not laughing with Ibrahim anymore. He was laughing to drown the sound of ending friendship. Later that night, I dreamed of the sea. It was black and endless, and from its depths rose two ships, one of gold, one of stone. They sailed side by side until the golden ship's reflection began to fade. Then, without wind or storm, it sank, silently, beautifully, as if it had chosen its own end. When I woke, the dawn was bleeding red across the horizon. Days later, Ibrahim was summoned to the palace under the pretense of counsel. He arrived at twilight, dressed in his finest silk. The guards bowed low as he entered, but their eyes did not follow him back out. That night, the palace held its breath. The torches burned low, even the fountains seemed to hush their songs. Somewhere in the unseen chambers, a cry was heard. Short, final, swallowed by silence. When the dawn came, it came gently, almost tenderly, as if ashamed of what it had witnessed. The Sultan said nothing for days, but I saw it in his face. The grief of a man who had cut off his own right hand. He called for me one evening, sitting by the same fire where the shadows now seemed heavier. I have ended him, he said simply. I have killed my friend. I knelt beside him and took his hand. Then may God give you peace. Peace, he murmured. Peace fled long ago. I wanted to speak, to tell him that the burden of rule demands blood, that mercy and power are enemies that can never share a bed. But I said nothing. I only held his hand until his tremor faded. From that day, the palace changed. The silence of mourning gave way to the whisper of new beginnings. And though grief shadowed him, the Sultan leaned on me more than ever before. We read again in the quiet hours, Rumi, Sadi, the Quran. He began to find in faith what he had lost in friendship. Once, as we watched the stars from the balcony, he said, I envy them, Hurrem. They burn and die, but the sky remains. I answered softly, perhaps the stars are not gone, my lord. Perhaps they simply rest where we cannot see them. He smiled faintly. You always have an answer. I met his gaze, only because I learned to listen. After Ibrahim's death, the empire turned its face toward me. Letters came addressed to the Sultan, but their true audience was me. I advised him on matters of charity, on new schools and mosques. Together we built the Haseki Sultan complex, a gift to God and the people, my name carved in stone beside his. For the first time in Ottoman history, a woman's vision shaped the skyline of Istanbul. The people whispered, she builds as men destroy. Perhaps that was my kind of conquest. At night, When the palace slept, I walked through the courtyard of my mosque. The marble gleamed under moonlight. The air smelled of jasmine and new beginnings. I ran my hand along the cool stone and whispered, "If I must be remembered, let it be for this, not for whispers of power, but for the peace I tried to give." In that stillness I felt her, my mother, the echo of her hands shaping bread in the flickering light of home. And for a heartbeat, I was no longer a queen or a concubine or a legend. I was simply her daughter, whispering into the night. "I made it, Mother. I am free now. I built something that will outlive even sorrow." But destiny, like the sea, it never sleeps. And far beyond the palace walls, new storms were gathering. Storms I could not yet see, but whose winds I could already feel in the silence between heartbeats. By the time the tulips bloomed again, the world had changed. The city still shimmered beneath its domes and towers, but it breathed slower now, older, as though even Istanbul had begun to feel the passing of time. I had risen as far as a woman could rise in this world, and yet, the higher I climbed, the more the sky itself seemed to weigh upon me. The Sultan had grown quieter. His strength was not gone, but tempered, a river that now flowed beneath the surface instead of rushing wild. He spoke less of war and more of eternity. And I, who had once spoken so easily, found myself listening more. Sometimes we sat together on the terrace above the gardens, where the sound of the Bosphorus rose and fell like a great animal breathing. Lanterns swayed on golden chains, and the scent of orange blossom lingered in the air. He would close his eyes, and for a moment, the ruler of half the world looked simply tired. "I dreamed," he said one evening, his voice distant, "that I was walking across a bridge of light, and on the other side stood all the faces I have loved. But when I reached them, they turned to dust." I touched his hand gently. "Perhaps they turned to light, not dust," I said. He smiled faintly, but his eyes did not open. Light or dust, they both returned to God. His faith had always been his fortress. Mine was memory, and memory, unlike faith, never forgives. The palace had grown full of ghosts, not the kind that haunt, but the kind that linger, in scents, in echoes, in empty corridors that once held laughter. Sometimes, while walking through the harem, I would hear my own footsteps and mistake them for someone else's. The walls of Topkapi had learned every secret I had ever whispered. They kept them better than any friend. There were nights when I could almost feel the younger version of myself walking beside me. The girl from Rohatyn, barefoot, wild, still smelling of pine and snow. She would look at me and ask, "Was it worth it?" And I would whisper back, "Ask me again when I am gone." Outside, the empire stretched farther than the mind could grasp, a body too vast for any heart to hold. Ambassadors came from Persia, from Poland, from Venice. They brought gifts, mirrors framed in gold, miniature paintings of kings and battles, perfumes from distant gardens. But what I valued most were their words. For behind every polite phrase lay a glimpse of the world beyond these walls. I began to write letters again, each one careful, measured, written in a hand steady enough to hide the tremor of feeling beneath it. To the Queen of Poland, I wrote, "I was once of your land. Time has carried me far, but the snow of these hills still lives in me. Tell your people that kindness can outlast conquest, and mercy is the only language understood by both king and slave. I never signed my name. I didn't need to. They knew who wrote them. One afternoon, a servant brought me word that the Sultan's eldest son, Mustafa, Mahidevran's child, had returned from campaign. He was no longer a boy, but a man. Strong, respected, beloved by the soldiers. The empire whispered of him as the heir apparent, the light of the dynasty. And though I smiled when I heard his name, a slow dread crept through me, because I knew that my own sons would now live beneath that same shadow. And shadows, in palaces, rarely bring peace. When Mustafa came to the harem to pay his respects, I greeted him with warmth. He bowed slightly, courteous but cold. "You are well, my lady," he said. "As are you, my prince," I answered. He smiled faintly. "The people speak of you often." "And what do they say?" "That you are the moon that commands the tides of my father's will." "Then may those tides carry peace to the empire," I said. But his tone had the edge of steel, or storms, perhaps. And with that, he bowed again and left. I watched him go, proud, beautiful, and dangerous, and felt the future tighten around us like a closing hand. Even at this late hour, a few lights twinkle in the town, a railroad lantern at the station, or a lamp in a tavern window. For it is a busy industrial town by day, a place of railroads and the great federal armory. We approach along the road, hugging the shadows under a stand of willow oaks. My heart pounds so loudly, I fancy it must echo off the cliffs. Yet the town slumbers, unsuspecting. As we creep closer, I can make out the hulking shapes of armory buildings against the night sky, and the pale outline of the Potomac Bridge we must capture. John motions half the men toward the bridge. Oliver Brown and a few others hurry to secure it and cut the telegraph wires, which they do with swift, practiced motions. Sparks snap in the dark as the lines are severed, isolating the town. The rest of us make directly for the armory gate. A lone watchman, an elderly man, steps forward in alarm at our silhouettes. "Halt! Who goes?" he begins, but he never finishes. Two of our men seize him, gently but firmly. "Don't be afraid. We don't mean you harm," John says to the wide-eyed guard as we surround him. In the wavering light of the watchman's lantern, John's face looks stern and solemn. "We have come to free the slaves," he announces in a calm, resolute tone. The guard is disarmed and bewildered. In minutes, we have the armory yard under our control. I can scarce believe how easily the first step has gone. We fan out through the armory grounds, taking possession of the dim workshops and the great arsenal hall where thousands of muskets stand locked in racks. A few startled workers and watchmen are rounded up without a fight and taken as prisoners. Through the cool night air, our breaths plume fight as we move swiftly, the adrenaline warming us from within. My senses feel sharply alive. The creak of a door hinge, the smell of gunpowder and iron, the sweat on my palms as I clutch my rifle. Every detail imprints itself in my memory. By dawn of October 17th, a faint gray light spreads over the sleeping town and the misty Potomac. Our initial surprise is complete. We hold the federal armory, the arsenal, and the rifle works. Several local notable men, including Colonel Lewis Washington, great-grandnephew of General Washington, have been taken from their beds by John's orders and brought as hostages. John believes these men of influence might persuade the locals not to attack us, and that their very presence will lend weight to our bold endeavor. He also hopes that by now, the enslaved people from the surrounding countryside are hearing the news that liberators are here. We expect that any moment, dozens, then hundreds of enslaved men and women will flock to us, ready to take up the pikes and guns we've brought to arm them. This faith sustains John. He is sure that the spark he strikes here at Harper's Ferry will catch and spread like wildfire through the South. In the pearly morning light, John dispatches small parties to secure the bridges and guard the arsenal's periphery. I find myself stationed near the engine house, a sturdy brick firehouse on the armory grounds, which we are using as a makeshift stronghold. Inside, some of our cache of pikes and rifles are stacked, ready to hand out to any slaves who answer the call. The morning is quiet at first, eerily so. A gentle fog drapes the town. The streets lie empty. For a brief moment, as I stand by the arched doorway of the engine house, I dare to hope it will be this simple, that we have caught Harper's Ferry unawares and will depart with a victory before the town can rouse itself. It is not to be. As the sun edges over the mountains, the town begins to stir, and word of our presence spreads. I hear the clanging of a church bell suddenly shatter the dawn hush, an alarm being raised. Almost immediately, sharp cracks of gunfire echo off the brick walls. Panicked townspeople and local militiamen, grabbing their rifles, have begun to shoot at our men from windows and alley corners. Bullets whistle past my ears. The armory gate that we so easily walk through in darkness is now blocked by hastily armed citizens. The air of Istanbul changed before I did. It grew slower, softer, the way a candle's flame trembles before it rests. Each morning, I woke to the sound of seagulls and distant prayers, the hum of life that would outlive me. The palace still gleamed, as it always had, its courtyards heavy with perfume. But even marble remembers time. The tiles, once bright as summer water, had faded gently like laughter that still lingers after the joke is forgotten. I had lived long enough to see the world turn beneath me. Once, I had been the captive girl who dreamed of freedom. Now I was the mother of princes, the voice beside a throne, the shadow behind an empire. But even shadows need rest. The Sultan had grown old, though he carried it with grace. His beard was white now, his eyes clear as the edge of a blade, his voice still deep, still commanding, though quieter. Sometimes, in the late evenings, he would summon me to the terrace above the Marmara. The city lights shimmered below, and the sea stretched dark and endless, full of secrets. He would speak softly, as if afraid to wake the past. "Hurrem," he said one night, "do you remember when we were young?" I smiled. "We were never young, my lord. We were born old, born into duty." He laughed, though his laughter now sounded like the echo of something once bright. "Perhaps that's true. But I remember your eyes the first night you entered this palace. I thought, she will destroy me." "Did I?" I asked. He turned to look at me. "No, you saved me, and I am not sure which is harder to forgive. Sometimes, when sleep eluded him, I read to him from the poets we once loved. Rumi, Hafiz, Yunus Emre. His favorite lines were always about surrender. When I read, 'Love is the sea where intellect drowns,' he closed his eyes, and I saw peace drift across his face like shadow on water. He whispered, 'I fear that I am the sea now.' And there is no shore left. I touched his hand. 'Then I will be your horizon.' He smiled faintly. You have always been. But peace, like perfume, never stays for long in the palace. The empire had grown too vast, too full of heirs and ambitions. My sons had become men and enemies. Mehmed, my firstborn, had ruled briefly. Then sickness took him in a cruel whisper. I buried him with hands that no longer trembled, though my heart did. When the news reached the Sultan, he said only, "The world loses its light one candle at a time." Selim and Bayezid now stood against each other, two stars circling the same sun, each desperate to be the brighter. I tried to keep peace between them, to weave my love like silk between their anger. But silk cannot bind fire. Their letters grew sharper, their words turned to wounds. And I, the woman who had bent empires with her smile, could not bend her own sons. Beyond the palace, the world still shimmered with power. Mosques rose like prayers carved in stone. Caravans brought spices, jewels, and silk from the ends of the earth. But the air of Istanbul carried a strange quiet, the silence of greatness aware of its own mortality. The Sultan rarely left the palace now. He prayed longer, spoke softer, looked westward more often, as if watching the horizon for a ship that would never come. And I, too, began to feel time's invisible hand on my shoulder, gentle but insistent. At night I often dreamed of my homeland, of snow on pine branches, of my mother's laughter, of a river frozen clear as glass. In my dreams, I was barefoot again, running through the woods, and every tree whispered my name. But when I turned to answer, I woke, the air heavy with incense, the sound of the fountain murmuring its endless story. I would lie there for hours, between sleep and memory, between the girl I was and the woman I had become. One evening, Selim came to me. He knelt, kissed my hand, and said, "Mother, my brother seeks to destroy me." I looked at his face, his father's calm eyes, my smile, and said softly, "Do not let hatred become your master." He answered, "It already has." When he left, I sat alone for a long time. The candles burned low, the flame trembling like a heartbeat. I thought of Bayezid, wild, beautiful, untamed. How could I choose between them? The world had demanded too many sacrifices already, I whispered. If the heart could bleed without dying, I would let it bleed for them both. In the days that followed, I prayed more than ever, not for victory, not even for mercy, but for understanding. The Sultan once told me that every prayer is a mirror. When we pray, we speak to our own soul. And when I closed my eyes, the voice that answered was not God's, but my own. It said, "All that you have built will crumble, but what you have loved will remain." I clung to those words as if they were the last bridge between this world and the next. In the city, the mosque that bore my name stood bright beneath the sun. Its domes gleamed like calm waves. Its minarets reached upward as if to touch mercy itself. Every morning, the call to prayer rose from it. My voice transformed into stone and song. Women came to its courtyard to draw water, to pray, to whisper their grief. I watched them sometimes from afar, unseen, and thought, perhaps this is what it means to live forever, to give others a place to rest. The Sultan's health began to fail. He hid it well, as he hid everything. But I saw it in the way he moved slower, in the way his eyes lingered longer on the past. One evening, he asked me to sit beside him by the fire. The lamps flickered gold against the carved walls. The air smelled of cedar and thyme. He said, We have walked a long road, you and I. Yes, I whispered. From chains to crowns. He smiled faintly. Do you regret it? I looked into the flames. No, even if it were all a dream, it was a beautiful one. He took my hand and pressed it to his lips. Then let us dream a little longer. But dreams, too, have their seasons. One morning, I woke to a stillness so deep that I knew something in me had already begun to say goodbye. The air felt lighter, the light softer, the very sound of the sea gentler. I walked to the balcony, wrapped in silk the color of dawn, and watched the sun rise over the domes. For the first time, I did not think of power, or destiny, or the past. I thought only of gratitude that I had lived, that I had loved, that I had built something that would sing after I was gone. I whispered to the wind, "Carry my name kindly." In my final dream, I was back in the garden of Topkapi. The fountains sang. The tulips leaned toward me like old friends. And from the far end of the garden came a woman walking slowly, her dress white, her hair loose as sunlight. It was my mother. She smiled and said, "Come, my daughter. The snow has melted. It's time to go home." I took her hand, and together we walked into the light. When the dawn came, the palace bells did not ring. The Sultan sat in silence beside my still form, his eyes dry, his hand resting over mine. Outside, the muezzin called to prayer. The city went on breathing, unaware that its quietest queen had slipped into eternity. He whispered, "You will be remembered in every breath I take." Then he rose, walked to the window, and watched the sea. The waves moved as they always had, steady, endless, eternal. And above them, the morning sun burned through the mist like forgiveness. The years passed, as all years do, quietly, like water shaping stone. And though the city changed its skin again and again, the heart of Istanbul never forgot her name. It whispered Hurrem through the rustle of cypress trees, in the hum of fountains, in the prayers that rose above the Bosphorus like threads of light. She was gone, yes, her body buried beneath marble and calligraphy. But her presence lingered like perfume after the wearer has left the room. Topkapi Palace, once so full of her laughter, still seemed to breathe her memory. Sometimes, when the wind moved through the lattice windows, the guards swore they heard a woman's soft voice humming to herself, a tune both foreign and familiar, a melody that seemed to come from the north. After her passing, the court continued its rituals as if nothing had changed. The same silver trays, the same gilded letters, the same soft footfalls in endless corridors. But those who had known her felt the absence like a pause in a song. The Sultan grew quieter than before, his steps slower, his gaze farther away. He spent long hours in the chamber where she had once read to him, his hand resting on her empty cushion, his eyes fixed on nothing, or perhaps on memory itself. He no longer spoke of war. Instead, he wrote poems, and every line carried her shadow. "You were the rose that bloomed in my winter, and when you fell, the garden forgot its color." His courtiers copied those verses in gold ink, sending them to distant lands as tokens of his mourning. But grief, like empire, is a thing that cannot be contained. It spills into every silence. Outside the palace, the city thrived. Markets alive with color, minarets catching the morning sun, the call to prayer rising like a heartbeat. Yet, even among the noise of the world, a gentler music remained, the sound of what she had built, of schools and fountains and mosques bearing her name. Women came from every corner of the empire to seek shelter under her endowments. Orphans found homes, hungry mouths found bread. And in the quiet shade of the courtyards she had designed, strangers whispered prayers for a woman they would never meet. Her charity became legend. They called her Hürrem Sultan, the Queen of Compassion. And even those who had once spoken against her now bowed when her name was uttered. But beyond the legend, beyond the politics and envy and power, there was still the story of one woman. A woman who had walked barefoot through snow and blood, and risen to shape a world that had sworn she never would. In the archives of the empire, her letters remained, written in careful Ottoman script, each line steady and deliberate. Scholars centuries later would trace those words with trembling fingers and find within them something that felt almost modern. A woman's mind thinking freely, her voice unbroken by the weight of time. One letter read, "A kingdom is not built by fear, nor kept by iron, but by the gentleness of a just heart." Another, sent to a European queen, said, "We are all made of the same clay, my sister, but it is love, not power, that gives it shape." He ruled for many years after her death, his reign stretching across lands that glittered under his banners. Yet those closest to him knew. The heart of his empire had already gone with her. He would sit by the marble window of his private chamber, watching the gulls drift over the water, his lips moving in silent recitation of her name. Sometimes he would walk to her tomb in the courtyard of the Süleymaniye Mosque, a structure he had built with his own grief, its dome rising like a prayer he could not speak aloud. There, surrounded by the scent of lilies and the hum of wind through stone, he would sit for hours in silence. The guard said he always left a single rose on her grave. And when asked why, he answered, "Because every empire needs something it cannot conquer." Years turned into decades, and the world began to forget the details, but never the feeling. The children born in her mosque grew old telling stories of the red-haired queen who changed the heart of a king. Painters painted her as myth. Poets turned her into symbol. And across the sea, in lands she had once feared, her name became legend. Roxelana, the foreign rose who ruled from behind the veil. Her sons' destinies unfolded like storms. Selim inherited the throne, gentle and uncertain. Bayezid met his end in exile. Cihangir's soul, too fragile for the world, faded before its time. But through their triumphs and tragedies, her blood endured, a current running quietly beneath the history of a vast and restless empire. Even now, when the sun rises over the domes of Istanbul, its light touches the stones she once walked upon. The fountains of her mosque still whisper, the tiles of her courtyard still glow after rain. And somewhere in that mingling of sea and wind and prayer, there is a note of laughter, faint but real. It is said that in the quiet before dawn, when the world holds its breath between night and morning, a soft perfume drifts through the courtyards of Topkapi, rosewater and amber, the scent she once wore. No one can say if it is memory, myth, or miracle. But those who breathe it swear that the air itself feels lighter, kinder, as though the walls remember how to love. History has a habit of reducing women like her to whispers. They call them enchantresses, temptresses, conspirators, as if brilliance were forbidden, as if tenderness were a weapon. But Hurrem was something else entirely. She was a mirror held to the world, showing men what they feared most. That love could be clever and intelligence could be kind. Her rise was not sorcery. It was courage. It was patience turned to strategy, pain turned to vision, laughter turned to power. And above all, it was the refusal to be invisible. The girl from the north had become the heart of the south, the voice of an empire that had once silenced her. And even centuries later, she speaks still, not in words, but in the way light falls through a lattice, in the way prayer sounds against stone, in the way every woman who is told you cannot whispers back, "Watch me." There are nights in Istanbul when the Bosphorus lies utterly still, the city asleep under its blanket of gold and shadow. In those hours, the palace dreams. The domes glimmer faintly, and the breeze from the sea moves through the old courtyards like a sigh. If you stand beneath the cypress trees near the fountain of the concubines, you might hear it. The faintest sound, a woman's laughter carried by the wind, soft as the rustle of silk, eternal as the tide. Some say it is imagination, others say it is love refusing to die. But those who have heard it never doubt. For in that moment, the empire breathes again, and through the hum of the sea, the murmur of prayer, and the music of the wind, the voice of Hurrem still speaks, not in sorrow, but in serenity. Power fades, beauty fades, but the heart that loves without fear, that heart becomes the wind. The empire that once ruled half the world has long since folded into history. The banners have faded, the soldiers have turned to dust, and the domes of Istanbul now belong to the sky alone. But some stories do not die with time. They dissolve into it, becoming part of the light, part of the wind, part of the breath of a city that never sleeps. And among those stories, hers still whispers the loudest. Hürrem Sultan, the concubine, the queen, the mother, the flame. Her name drifts through the centuries like perfume that never loses its scent. In the morning light, when the Bosphorus is still and the gulls glide like white prayers over the water, the first rays of dawn touch the domes she left behind. The Haseki Mosque still stands, serene, golden, unbroken. The air inside it smells faintly of rose and stone. Women gather to pray, their whispers rising like mist, and somewhere between those murmured verses, her spirit stirs. A little girl looks up at the carved ceiling and asks her mother, "Who built this place?" Her mother smiles and answers, "A woman, long ago." And the girl's eyes widen, because even now, the thought of a woman shaping the skyline feels like magic. Outside, tulips bloom again, the same colors she once loved, and every petal seems to hold a memory of her laughter. Time has rewritten the empire's name 1,000 times. Sultans became statues, wars became dates, and the calligraphies on palace walls became museum pieces, glowing beneath glass and soft electric light. Tourists move through the old halls, their footsteps echoing on marble worn smooth by centuries of lives. They pause before a jeweled mirror, before a gilded cradle, before the portraits of the rulers who once commanded continents. And in one quiet room, where sunlight filters through a lattice of gold, they find her. A single painting, a woman with copper hair, emerald eyes, and the faintest smile. Half triumph, half sorrow. The guide's voice drifts through the still air. She was once a slave, who became the queen of the empire. The visitors stand silent for a moment. Some take pictures, some simply look. And maybe, without knowing why, some feel a strange tenderness. Because even now, her story feels like something the heart already knows. Outside the palace walls, the city lives as it always has. Boats move across the water. The call to prayer rolls through the air, like a song older than memory. And the wind, always the wind, wanders through the courtyards and domes, carrying the same quiet rhythm. It moves past the fountains she built, past the mosaics she chose, past the stones that once heard her voice. And for those who pause long enough to listen, there is still something there. Not a sound, but a feeling, like being seen by something kind. In another century, a writer opens a book in a candlelit room. The pages speak of her again, not as myth, but as woman. He reads her letters, her deeds, her dreams, and he realizes that history did not bury her. It only made her softer, like silk worn thin by time, still beautiful in its quietness. He writes, Hürrem Sultan was not merely a name in gold or a shadow behind a throne. She was proof that tenderness can shape an empire, and his pen moves slowly, as if the ink itself knows it carries her heartbeat. Far away, across the sea, in another world, a woman walks into her office, her classroom, her home. She does not know Hurrem's full story, but she carries something of her in the way she speaks, in the way she refuses to be silent, in the way she loves fiercely while holding her head high. Every woman who rises against silence carries a spark of her fire, a whisper of that laughter that once echoed through marble halls. And maybe that's how immortality works, not through monuments or crowns, but through the courage that outlives its name. At dusk, when the museum closes and the tourists have gone, the palace grows quiet again. The last rays of sun turn the domes to copper. The air cools, thick with the scent of jasmine. A single guard walks the empty courtyard, his footsteps soft. He pauses by the fountain of tears, where droplets fall endlessly, reflecting 1,000 little suns. He says he sometimes hears her there. Not a voice, not a song, just the faint echo of movement, like silk brushing against stone. When he looks up, he always finds the same thing. A swirl of wind spiraling through the arches, carrying with it the scent of rose water. And he whispers into the air, "Good night, my lady." The wind answers softly, like a sigh that might also be a smile. When the moon rises above Istanbul, its light finds her resting place, side by side with the man who loved her beyond reason. 2 tombs, 2 names, and 1 silence that holds them both. Above them, the calligraphy gleams in the dim light. In love and mercy, the soul finds its throne. And if you stand there long enough, you might feel it. A calmness, deep and ancient, as if the air itself remembers what it means to be loved. And so her story ends, not with death, but with continuity. Not with power, but with peace. Her laughter still sleeps in the stones. Her prayers still drift through the air. Her name still lives in the heartbeat of a city that refuses to forget. And perhaps, somewhere beyond time, beyond empire, beyond history, she stands once more in a garden of light, the same garden she dreamed of as a child, the same one that appeared in her visions again and again. She walks barefoot through the grass, the air cool, the horizon endless. The wind moves through her hair, whispering, "You are home." And the sea, that old storyteller, answers in its language of waves and breath, "Yes, you are remembered." And so ends the story of Hürrem Sultan, the slave who became a queen, the laughter that echoed through centuries of power and silence. Her spirit still lingers in the marble halls of Topkapi, where rose petals and secrets sleep side by side. Tell me, dear listener, which empire's legend shall we uncover next? Until then, let the whispers of history lull you into dreams.